I'd like to welcome everybody, and I think we'll start the session. So thank you all for joining us today. I think more people are coming in, but we should get started. Welcome on behalf of Security and Context. I'd like to welcome you to today's event, Energy, Security and Geopolitics in the 21st Century. My name is Omar Dahi. I'm a professor of economics at Hampshire College and the director of Security and Context. Let me start by briefly discussing the questions that I have sent to today's panelists and sort of the topic of the discussion, which relates to energy security, that I invited our panelists to discuss today. And the questions were that the concept of energy security emerged to the public in the 1970s in the aftermath of the 1973 global oil crisis. However, the relationship between energy security and conflict dates back much further, and the pursuit of energy security is widely thought to be a pillar of US foreign policy since at least World War II, if not earlier. What does the historical record in the US and elsewhere tell us about energy security, geopolitics, and conflict? How have energy systems changed over the years? Moving forward, and with a worldwide emphasis on decarbonization as a response to climate change, how can we think about these relationships today? Is the search for energy security a driver of conflict? How can we conceptualize alternatives? And I should say these questions and this panel were convened long before the current Ukraine crisis. So obviously this is what the world's attention and all of ours, and I'm sure the audience's attention is today. So of course, we'd love to incorporate and discuss the role that energy plays in the Ukraine war, although our speakers might decide to answer these questions in a broader sense, and then in the second round we can discuss that, or in the Q&A. With that, I'll hand it over to Michael.
Okay, well, I'm dying to hear from Emily and Bob, but I will make some comments, and this is what you might call a warning. I'm not particularly optimistic about the future, so don't expect me to come out with some good news at the end. I really don't have any. So I'm just going to throw out some points on the wall, and we'll see what sticks. And really dying to hear what my colleagues here have to think about it, because maybe between us we could get some clarity. So I'm going to start with the proposition that the post-Ukraine war, at the end of the Ukraine war, whenever that is, we're going to have a new world order. The world will be completely realigned in ways that we cannot fully anticipate, and that the world's energy order will be similarly realigned substantially, totally, completely, to follow how the world order itself is realigned. So how will the world order be realigned? That depends on the outcome of the war in Ukraine. So we have to ask, how is it going to end? Because it hasn't ended yet, and we don't know how it's going to end. The worst case scenario is it will lead to a nuclear war, thermonuclear Armageddon, and we don't have to worry about these questions after that. And, you know, we could smile about that, and I hope that that's dark humor, but it's not an impossible consideration at this point. I could give you a number of routes by which that could happen. The next possibility, very likely, is that the war drags on. It just drags on. And then we have a kind of a Berlin Wall constant crisis in Europe, where NATO is constantly on alert. Russian forces are always on the edge of NATO territory. You know, there's a new crisis every 24 hours, and the world is highly militarized and polarized, and war making takes over all of society. And this strikes me as a very likely outcome. Another possible outcome is the war ends sometime in the next few weeks with Ukraine divided somehow, with a western part and an eastern part under Russian control, and then we have Cold War II, Europe frozen, maybe not quite as dangerous as a continuing war, but pretty much like I described with the West, the NATO powers constantly mobilized, war fever, war priorities take over everything, and that being the dominant priority. In either of these cases, we have to ask is what role does China play in all of this? Does China remain aligned closely enough to Russia, whatever it says, that it's seen in the West as an accomplice, in which case it will be, I'm sure, will be subjected to the same kind of economic punishments and sanctions that Russia is being subjected to, and the world will be cleaved in half, economically, politically, diplomatically, militarily, and that will be the new world order, a world in two parts, constantly on edge, with the borders between these two worlds fought over, proxy wars, crises all the time. It's possible that China will see the handwriting on the wall that this is a catastrophic choice and will choose to align with the West. I don't think it's going to try to stay in the middle. I don't think that's an option. I wonder what you folks think about that. But it could align with the West and cut off its ties with Russia, in which case Russia declines and becomes a failed state. And you might have state collapse. We can think about that. So, those are the options. I don't know. I'd like to know if there's any other possible option, but we're in a new world order. So what are the implications for the new world energy order? One way or the other, I think we're likely to see the loss of 10% of world oil output, or world oil export, I mean, and something like 30% of natural gas exports. That's a huge contraction in the world's energy supply. I don't see that coming back soon, if ever. The sanctions against Russia target its technological capacities, particularly its ability to boost production in the Arctic and in shale formations. So it'll take a very long time for Russia to ever regain the ground that it's going to lose. So we have to expect a permanent contraction in the world oil and gas supply. And as Omar indicated, the only real precedent for this is the oil shocks of 1973 over the October War, and then in 1979, the Iranian Revolution. What was the response back then? What they called the strategy of diversification, to seek oil. Then oil was, the primary concern. More domestic drilling in the United States, in Alaska, offshore, and in shale formations, to seek and develop other sources of supply in places like Africa, offshore Asia, offshore Latin America. And this succeeded over time to create a huge increase in global oil production, leading in time to overcapacity in world oil production as time went on. And we're going to hear now the same demand. We are hearing the same demands now from Republicans in Congress to lift restrictions on all environmental restrictions on oil drilling in offshore US, in federal lands and the Arctic National Refuge and so on. We're also seeing efforts by the administration to get oil from places that have been cut off, like Venezuela and Iran. And there'll be efforts to persuade the Saudis and Emiratis and Kuwait to increase production. Not going very well, by the way. But you add all this up, and you're still not going to be able to replace Russia, I think, in the near term. What role does China play in all of this? If it joins with Russia, well, that's a help in a way, because it could consume Russian oil and gas and make it easier for the West, because it won't be competing. If it shuns Russia, well, then China's going to be competing for the same oil and gas as the rest of us. And that's going to put a huge pressure on supplies and pressure. And I think this will lead to intense competition for control over places in Africa and elsewhere for what's left of the available supplies, and intense political, maybe military pressure for access to those places. What about decarbonization? I think there'll be some calls for increased green technology in Europe, especially, but I think that's going to go out the window in most places. In the U.S., for sure. I don't see Biden being able to resurrect his climate plans. In China, the reports are that they've rapidly ramped up coal production in the past few months, and I think China is going to be heavily invested in fossil fuels. So, in a bifurcated New World Order, I think with no cooperation between the major parties, there's no way to keep temperatures from going beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius, or to keep it from going beyond 2 degrees Celsius. So I think the climate will proceed on an even more rapid path towards catastrophic outcomes if we escape World War III. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Michael. Emily?
So first I should say up front, I'm first really happy to be here. It's great to be on a panel with these folks and to get to discuss these issues. I should also mention from the very outset that the views that I'm expressing here are my own. They do not represent the Department of the Navy, the Department of Defense, or the US government more broadly. So just speaking for myself. The remarks that I had prepared actually were sort of more contextual, but I think that Michael actually led me into them very well, because when talking about the potential consequences of a shortfall in Russian energy output, we've seen over the course of the last 15 years, we've seen the discourse about energy security, and specifically oil security, shift from oil scarcity, 2008, we're running out of oil, it's peak oil, to then oil abundance. After the US shale revolution, after the crash of oil prices in 2014 to 2015, suddenly we had plenty of oil. Now we seem to be entering a new period of scarcity. Certainly over the course of the last 3 months, we've seen a massive increase in oil prices. And there's a lot of uncertainty about whether those are going down anytime soon. Certainly not as long as the war drags on, it seems like. So we're now again in this situation of scarcity. That being said, I do think this is a different situation than we were in 15 years ago, because the issue isn't physical scarcity. The issue is, will these oil resources actually get explored for, developed, extracted, and sold? And as a result, I think that the geopolitical dynamics are different. And based on that, and based on my own research, I'm less pessimistic about the risk of competition between countries for resources. And so I'm actually going to recap a little of the material from my book, which is called The Oil Wars Myth, which probably makes you think you know where it's headed. But my research is literally focused on this question about whether or not countries fight for control over energy resources. And for the book, I looked at every case of militarized conflict between two or more countries from 1912 to 2010, in which they were fighting over territories that either were known or believed to contain oil and gas resources. So that's about 180 cases worldwide. And what I found, to my surprise, was that countries actually don't fight over control of oil all that much. They don't engage in these major conflicts to gain control over oil supplies. Instead, they do a variety of other things. Generally, what they're doing is they're fighting in areas with oil and gas resources, but for other reasons. That can be a matter of aspirations to regional hegemony. That can be about national pride. It can be about domestic politics, but it's really not about the region's oil and gas. Some of the conflicts that we think of as oil wars, the Chaco War between Bolivia and Paraguay in the 1930s, the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, these are actually primarily prompted by other issues. Second, we do sometimes see countries engaging in these smaller scale conflicts in which they are fighting for oil or gas, but they're not fighting very hard. If you think about the confrontation between China and Vietnam over an oil rig in the South China Sea in 2014, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. One country tries to explore for oil, another country tries to stop it. There's a lot of hue and cry about possible escalation while it's underway, but then the governments control it. We've seen about 20 of those over a century. They've never escalated. They look pretty bad, but then they calm down. Third, we have seen some countries try to seize oil resources in the midst of ongoing wars. This is World War II. In Europe, Germany, 2 years into the war, tries to seize oil resources in Russia. In Southeast Asia, 1941, Japan tries to seize the oil resources of the Dutch East Indies. At which point you're probably saying, wait a minute, didn't that start World War II? It started it for the United States. Japan was already involved in a war. It had been at war with China since the 1931 or 1937, depending on how you count. So we see these oil campaigns in the midst of wars that started for other reasons. The only case where we have a country that actually might have initiated a war to seize its neighbors' resources is Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990. And even this case is a lot more complicated than we usually think. I did research in the Iraqi regime archives that the United States took in 2003. And what I found was that Saddam was terrified of the United States. He believed that the US was out to get him. He thought that after the Iran-Iraq War ended in 1988, Iraq was a rising power and was destined to be the leader of the Middle East. And so he thought that put a target on his back, that basically the United States would do everything it could to take him down. And that included encouraging other countries in the region to exceed their OPEC oil production quotas and drive oil prices down. And he saw all of this as part of a coordinated attack against him. And eventually he concluded that the only way to push back was to invade Kuwait. I definitely see some resonance of this case in what's happening in Europe right now, in terms of the way that Putin has framed his invasion, and even the rhetoric that both leaders use as part of their aggression. So again, this is a case, Iraq did seize Kuwait's oil, but there's a lot more going on. So in the book, I talk about why these oil wars don't happen. The basic takeaway is it's really hard to exploit conquered oil. So these conflicts just don't pay. And countries find other ways of getting the oil and gas they need, whether that's through new exploration, buying it, coming up with preferential contracts. Basically, war is a last resort, and it's extraordinarily uncommon generally because countries just don't get themselves into those situations unless they're already at war. That being said, my concern for our current situation is that the situations where countries actually end up in these desperate conditions are when the market fails. So the more we're seeing a manipulation of the energy market and potential deliberate restrictions of supplies to different countries, I think the more potential there is, first, the more unknowns there are, because we are on uncharted territory. But the more risk there is of something going astray. And so one thing I think that the United States should be thinking about as we move forward, and again, speaking for myself, is trying not to restrict other consuming countries' access to oil. And here I really mean China. That if the United States gets in the way of China's access to oil supplies, China's going to freak out. They're going to see it as an act of aggression, and that really could be a source of intensifying international tensions. So what does this mean? Takeaways? On the positive side, I don't think we're going to see countries fighting for oil resources, even in the current climate of scarcity. I think they will find other options. On the negative side, even if countries aren't fighting over oil and gas, they could still fight for other reasons. So good news about oil and gas wars, not so good news about wars in general. I would be happy to talk a bit about how a transition away from oil and gas to renewable energy sources, alternative energy sources, shift these dynamics. Basic preview of that is I think that the expectations of resource wars over other resources as well, probably overstated. But happy to go into that or happy to debate that with anyone else here. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emily. We'll definitely try to come back to the question of decarbonization in the discussion, hopefully. But meanwhile, I'll hand it over to Bob.
Okay, thank you all. I'm in this funny position, which is I think I'm going to sound optimistic in some strange way, which also makes no sense because I'm generally feeling like Michael. And I think it explains why I've actually been, kind of depressed over the past couple of weeks. I'm not being able to get work done, et cetera. And as a guy, I'm not exploring that enough for it to be reasonable. I'm just taking it out in various ways. So let's see. I want to thank you all for including me. Michael Klare has mattered to me, well, since about 1980 or so. His work has been so profoundly influential, both as an intellectual, as a revisionist critic, as an anti-imperialist thinker and activist, and someone who is committed to something that no longer exists called peace studies, as far as I can see. So for many, many reasons, Klare, he actually deserves studies of his work in his own right. And I'm hoping some folks move in that direction. Emily I described her recently as a vital national resource. If you haven't read her book, please go grab it. It's fantastic. And Omar, well, I just love Omar. And so I'm going to return that love by pushing back on the assumption behind the webinar that energy security has been a pillar of US foreign policy since World War II, if not earlier. But only after I push back on his description of me as an expert on energy and US foreign policy, or anything else for that matter. I actually think of myself as a recovering Middle East expert and someone lucky enough to be able to study and write about things I grow curious about. And one of those things I've grown really curious about is all the funny ideas, or to be more formal about it, factitious things that people, experts, among them, believe, in this case about oil. So take the motivating idea of the event. Energy security as a pillar of US foreign policy since at least World War II, if not earlier. That's a variant of the more general claim that the struggle for oil in particular is a defining feature of all of the 20th century. Now, if you take Emily seriously, you can see how there's some problems in that framing, but it's nonetheless, I would say, virtually the conventional wisdom, common sense, right? This fact, though, this is what interests me. This fact about what supposedly drove the 20th century is only a fact since the 1970s and driven by the so-called oil crisis of that decade. Since then, folks have gone back not so much to test that claim and ideally try to falsify it, as we say, but rather to find evidence in support of some political commitment or another, energy security or conservation or the overthrow of the so-called fossil capitalist order. Okay, minimally, we need to grapple with the fact that no one back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, or 50s, or 60s for that matter, believed this. And with what they actually believed, that oil was just one and hardly the most important resource that mattered to development or security or what have you. And then what I discovered, and I should say I'm guilty of it too, by the way, okay, is that we've piled on factitious belief on top of factitious belief about the past after the 1973 crisis. And we repeat them all now like a mantra as common sense, right? So Omar knows what I'm going to bring up now. I have a particular fondness for the idea that an oil for security deal was cut between Franklin Delano Roosevelt and King Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia in 1945. We take this as gospel truth, although no one believed any such thing until the time of 9/11, as far as I've been able to determine, okay? So 1973 matters a lot, right? If that's the motive, if that's the cause of the trauma that leads people to these ways of thinking that I'm sort of saying can't be supported. So 73 matters a lot. And I loved going back to seeing the arguments being put forward as oil prices skyrocketed in the midst of a war between Israel, Egypt, and Syria. And OPEC became a household word for the first time, and all the rest. Now, only Michael and I were actual witnesses to this moment. I was a freshman commuting to college in 1973 during the infamous gas lines. In that decade, the tremendous accumulation of petrodollars, Egypt's turn to the West, the building of the so-called special relation Saudi Arabia, all these things really basically shaped my career trajectory. As a grad student at the time of the Iranian Revolution and a newly minted professor in the 1980s during the crash in oil prices, and all my older UT Austin, Texas colleagues crashing in their retirement accounts. Now, all I'm saying is it has taken me a long time to shake myself loose from those decades and my own thinking. So one thing that has interested me in the past few weeks is how many of the arguments bring us right back to that time. We are seeing, for instance, a resurrection of the belief that dependency on foreign sources is the root of many evils, right? My favorite example of this is John Mearsheimer, who's getting a lot of pushback on all sorts of other things these past few weeks because of his interview in the New Yorker and because, you know, he's seen as the propagandist for Russia and all that other craziness. But if you go read Mearsheimer's interview with Chotiner in the New Yorker, you will see that he claims that the U.S. dependency on Saudi Arabia, he doesn't explain what exactly it is that the Saudis are doing that are constraining us. But he says it's our dependency on oil that keeps us from pushing them in a democratic direction or accepting them as an autocracy. Okay, and there are plenty of other people who think the same thing. More generally, and Michael was evoking some of this in his comments, is the resurrected argument about the need for energy independence, and because this thing called energy independence, which is a fantasy, an impossibility, that requires us to support the frackers. So even my sister, who I've never seen her post on any kind of foreign policy problems since we've been Facebook friends, posted a picture of a meme that said open up the Dakota pipeline again. And I don't know why she thinks this, but somehow this is going to solve the problems that the U.S. that she finds herself in as she commutes from Port Jefferson to Huntington every day, and gas prices are going up. So equally interesting is the way 1973 has to be portrayed today in explicating the newest oil price shock. Back then, okay, while there was some Arab bashing going on and calls to take over the oil fields, thank God conservatives have not yet sought to resurrect this particular piece of policy wisdom. Who knows, right? Most Democrats and progressives, though, didn't blame the Arabs for the price shock. They blamed the oil companies because they said the Arabs simply couldn't do such a thing on their own. And in fact, we have seen a little tug in this direction with the accusations, say, of Bernie Sanders and others of companies price gouging these days and taking advantage of conditions, right? And you have to trust me on this, based on books I've just reviewed, the now conventional explanation for the price rise in 1973 is that OPEC countries raised the price unilaterally, twice, people say, in a few short months, quadrupling the price that refiners paid. I have many things to say about this claim. I'm not saying it's true. Reality now is way more complicated than the historians of U.S. foreign policy of the 1970s have imagined, since historians are now studying the 1970s. It's very frightening to me. But one interesting tidbit is, if you read the newspapers of the past few days, you don't see anything about a quadrupling of oil prices, right? At best, they triple, okay? And I'm telling you that OPEC really had nothing to do with it. But leave that aside, okay? Here's the deal. Putin is obviously not OPEC, although some fantasized about him cutting the West's oil supplies. Put it another way, there's no embargo. There's no OPEC, right? So for the past few weeks, the accounts of 1973 have all talked about not the OPEC price rise as the cause, but the so-called oil embargo by Arab producers as the cause of the price rise. So we went from one explanation that is now the scholarly conventional wisdom to another, because it frankly just fits the story better, okay? This is, and again, that embargo is also, that embargo also did not cause the price rise, right? Again, reality is more complicated. What I'm pointing to here is just how capacious our accounts of the past can be depending on our current circumstances. Now, there's a silver lining in all the hand-wringing of the past few weeks on NPR, Marketplace, where I learned more about oil prices than I had and what causes oil, how oil is delivered to the world than I've learned in years, and the like, right? The present moment confirms, and I know this is going to seem strange in the midst of a crisis where prices are rising and folks are maximally stressed. The present moment confirms the old insight of Ronnie Lipschutz, who argued that the increasing and then decreasing visibility of oil dependency means it's not a problem in the usual sense of the word, but rather one that is used for other purposes. So to turn that into English, if you want, it's Emily's point, right? We were talking about the end of peak demand just a few years ago. That we were making the transition, right? And now we're, as she sort of said, now there's kind of talk about, oil shortages and supply constraints, et cetera, okay? But where were we years ago? Why, it's a crisis now. What were the administrations doing before then? If this is in fact a fundamental policy problem or national security problem, right? Or remember this, I told you I would tell you some silver linings. One is, remember the argument that the United States is in the Persian Gulf. Why? To secure the free flow of oil at competitive prices or at reasonable prices for the world. Well, that argument's gone out the window. We're there, in the Persian Gulf, and the action is all happening somewhere else, okay? Here's what we've seen instead. If you just think about this with a minimum of, you don't even have to remove blinkers because you can see this now yourselves. It turns out that the United States is a main source of threat to world oil supply, right? We've cut off oil from Iran, from Venezuela, and now Russia. right? So despite this idea that the U.S. is there to secure the free flow of oil because it's this resource of fundamental geostrategic importance, we have the actual data or empirics of actually the United States is reducing the amount of oil on the world market, right? And there are still people today, right, as the United States. Well, we'll talk about what President Biden is doing, perhaps, but there are still people today saying, no, don't do this. These are our enemies. We can find oil elsewhere and so forth, right? Now, the final silver lining is, I think while we're talking about shortages for supply, I have not heard the argument I last heard in the early 2000s that the increased prices are the outcome of a real physical scarcity for the stuff, right? So it's scarcity, but of a different sort, that the supply is constrained, not the earth can't produce more of this stuff in any sense. So I think that's a good thing. I'm not saying, I don't know, Emily might be right that we move in that direction. So just one more thing. So what is going on there? Why is President Biden going off to Venezuela to getting pissed off because the Saudis aren't talking to him, thinking about the Iran deal? I think that's all electioneering. There is literally nothing one can do in the short term, as Michael, I think, has been suggesting, and Emily, and I think was suggesting, but definitely Michael, there's not much that you can do that is going to reduce oil prices in the short term, right? So President Biden has to look like he's doing something because he is going to get hammered. We know, right, that people are looking at those gas prices and they're putting the numbers up every day. And we know that psychologically, people think, that's a marker of something, and they draw so many conclusions from it, even though we know that, for instance, the Fed doesn't even pay attention to gas prices, right, when it's kind of thinking about its strategies for inflation control, right? But public thinks about it. Biden's getting hammered by it. If you come to where I live in Mount Airy, there's a sticker on my gas, gasoline pump that has Biden pointing to the price, and it says, I've done this, right? So it's being used for short-term political gain, and Biden has to look like he's got some options there, but he really doesn't, and it's going to be for him down the road. So, but I don't know if that's a silver lining or not. So I'll stop there, and thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you all so much. This was such a great opening round of interventions, and I think there's so much to pick up on. We've been having some questions from the audience, and I also wanted to see if Michael wanted to follow up with the response to some of the things that you just heard. But I mean, one of the things, just in response to what Bob and Emily said, and I've read both your books, and I highly recommend them for anyone who hasn't read them, the Oilcraft book by Michael and the Oil Wars Myth by Emily. And of course, I've read all of Michael's work that I can get my hands on. But part of it, and then I want to incorporate a couple of questions from the audience. But I mean, in a way, the oil being the pillar of U.S. foreign policy, in a way, it's meant to sort of precisely avoid this type of moment where another big power has leverage over oil resources in a way that it can be used to threaten or to, in a way, use it in a way that's adversarial to U.S. interests. So part of the idea is not, at least that I had in my mind, which you say is conventional wisdom, is that it's not simply oil driving the wars, but control and being able to have leverage to sort of consolidate U.S. hegemony or U.S. power globally, to prevent other countries from using it as leverage, and also potentially to use it as leverage over other countries. Is that, does the current crisis confirm that that's also not true? Does it confirm that there's something to that thesis, or is it going to change moving forward? And the other aspect of that, and I think, and Emily, your book is really lays out a really nice case for why oil wars don't pay. But that also assumes that states are rational actors, that rationally can look at the costs and benefits of these interventions. And I'm thinking about the U.S. occupation of Afghanistan vis-a-vis U.S. interests, and whether did they rationally achieve those in terms of the costs of that were spent there. So is there something about states thinking that oil matters in a way that might lead them, especially moving forward in a certain behavior? I mean, you raised the possibility that if US tries to cut off China from oil, will that make it more adversarial? I don't know if you had any responses to those, or Michael, you had a follow-up to this before we go to the audience questions.
Well, I so enjoy this conversation, and I'd love to spend the rest of the day going back and forth so we could challenge each other on each of these points. But that wouldn't be fair. I want to make 2 points very briefly. One to both Bob and Emily. I didn't argue. I'm sure I did argue that the U.S. fought wars for oil, at least in public settings. But I've tried to argue that oil has, and I've always said this, oil has many values. It is a fuel, an essential fuel, and that's one reason why you might fight. That's, for Germany, the move towards the Caucasus was oil as a fuel, an essential fuel. Oil is also a source of immense wealth. And I think there are people who are prepared to fight or talk about fighting to gain oil as a source of revenue for corporations that had or have a political influence. But oil is also a source of power. Who controls the flow of oil supposedly exercises geopolitical power, political power. And I think the US was never in the Middle East to protect the free flow of oil or to get oil for its own use or for any of those reasons. The US was in the Middle East to control, because oil, in the view of US leaders, had immense geopolitical and political power. And it was to prevent anybody else from having the finger on the control over the flow. And that's why the US is there. And this is an implied threat to China. And especially recently, in recent years, decades now. And this matters in the current situation because I think Chinese leaders have studied this literature. You go to, when it was possible to talk to Chinese scholars, they were very clear that they feared that in a conflict over Taiwan, for example, that the US would cut off the maritime flow of oil from the Middle East. And therefore, they were highly dependent on internal means of communication, of flow. And so China has assiduously courted the Central Asian countries, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, to build pipelines for internal supply. And Russia is extremely attractive from that point of view as a counterweight or as an alternative to oil coming by sea that's exposed to the US Navy. One of the reasons they cite for building up the Chinese Navy is to protect the oil supplies from Africa, but they know that they can overpower the US Navy. So one of the reasons that I think China has been pushed into the arms of Russia, which I don't think they entirely look forward to, is as a counterweight or alternative to dependence on maritime flows that is under the US thumb. And so Emily's point, I think, is really, really important, that if the US threatens China's access to oil other than Russia, then China will have no choice but to align with Russia and push us deeper into this divided, bifurcated hideously dangerous worlds.
I think if I can add in here, first, Omar, your point about states and rationality, that was something that was really striking to me in the book, because I had equally low expectations about rational states, and yet they consistently seem to be on top of it for this issue. Why that's the case when there are so many myths about oil running around, I am not sure. So their behavior aligned in that way, but it's still kind of mysterious to me, the fact that when push came to shove, they seem to be able to make good choices. But I think that's would be a great thing to look at more. And I think maybe it speaks to Bob's point about how much of this, the way that we talk about oil is performative and rhetorical and trying to achieve something else. But then behind closed doors, governments are like, no, we know how this works. And then following up on one of Michael's observations, which are great, about this idea of oil as a source of power. I 100% agree. Well, I don't think countries are fighting over it. I think the idea that that oil, having authority over oil, being more independent when it comes to oil, is empowering. Being more dependent on external supplies can be constraining. And 100% agree that China is dependent on oil for more than 70% of its consumption. That's a big number, and it's a huge source of concern. And they're concerned about the United States trying to blockade supplies during a war. I think there are reasons that we'd have a very hard time doing that. They're also, and this is starting to get into some of the questions, they're also very concerned about their ability to pay for oil resources. Oil is denominated predominantly in dollars. That means any country that wants to buy oil has to pay for it in dollars. That means that the payment at some point has to go through the US financial system. If China is blocked from the US financial system, it will not be able to easily pay for those oil imports. And so this is a real concern for the Chinese. And this is also, this has become an issue for Russia about how does it sell its oil resources in terms of, and there are carve-outs in the current sanctions, so Russia can continue to sell its oil and gas. But the United States' position in the global financial system is a real point of concern for Russia, for China, for Iran, because that's what we've used to block their oil sales, for Venezuela. And there is this real risk that these countries will, in light of US sanctions and in light of US financial dominance, try to build up an alternative network, essentially, of resource suppliers and buyers. There are a number of obstacles that will get in their way. So in response to the comment in the question in the chat, I don't think we're going to see dollars being denominated extensively in yuan anytime soon. But the more the United States employs this tool of financial sanctions, the stronger the incentive these countries have to try to insulate themselves against that kind of new kind of oil weapon. I'm also, if I can, just going to briefly comment on a couple of questions, probably because I recognize one of the names in the Q&A, which I'm delighted to see. Former student, former outstanding student. Can Russia afford to cut off its natural gas supply to Europe? It would take a hit. For Russia, 2/3 of its energy income is from oil. So actually blocking Russian oil sales is more of a problem economically. Can it afford it? I can't say yes or no, but the real hit that it's concerned about is the oil one. And it is taking that hit. Russia is having trouble selling its sales have dropped by like 70%. Nobody wants that oil. Even the countries that still can buy it they're not buying it. Tankers don't want to ship it. Banks don't want to finance purchases. They're getting hit hard in terms of oil, being able to sell their oil resources. And I will let other folks, I could go on forever, but I will let others jump in.
Thanks, Emily. Let me actually read the rest of the questions as well. So the question that you just answered, thank you, Emily, it was about, can Russia afford to cut off its natural gas supply to Europe? Because if it does, Europe will have a really hard time to compensate the loss of the supply. This is from Dimitrios Vogiatis. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing your name. Sorry about that. Another question Thank you for these excellent insights. My question concerns the sustainability of European sanctions. How likely is a consensus around sanctions to last when gas dependency is so high? What happens internally within the EU when the long-term effects described by Professor Klare take root? A third question is on the future of the petrodollar. What is the future of the petrodollar? I don't know if anyone cares to comment, but I think it's tied also to questions about international finance and some of the issues that Emily mentioned as well. And finally, a question again for you, a question for Dr. Emily: what sort of myths about oil and oil wars are we seeing repeated in the news today or in the broader conversation that perhaps Professors Klare and Vitalis did not cover in their reflections? Anyone wanting to take or comment on any of these questions or anything else that was discussed so far?
Michael's right. We could do another hour on this, and I would love to, about hegemony, et cetera. But I just want to point one thing out about financialization. And Omar, you know my take on this already, but it seems worthwhile stressing. This is one of these moments where, because of the conjuncture, we think that somehow petrodollars themselves are the key to the world. But the dollar is the currency that all importers, exporters of virtually all commodities and all manufactured goods use to sell on the world market, right? So this is not something about oil produced this, or it matters, or that there was a specific agreement to denominate oil in dollars, because it's just always been the case, with the Russians still doing it, the Chinese still doing it, et cetera. And so I think, you know, the future of the financial system, it goes way beyond the question about oil and petrodollars and the particular countries that are under sanction by the United States. And I just want to add a small comment to what Emily said, which is she used the phrase the US financial system. So I want to make sure that people understand what that means. She's not talking about physically the United States and money deposited in the United States. Yes, Iran has been sanctioned with the resources that remain in the United States from the time of the Shah. But the major sanctions is denying these countries access to, if you want, and as we're seeing it right now with Russia, the global financial system represented by SWIFT and so forth. So countries have their foreign exchange earnings in dollars and in euros, but for instance, 30 or 40% of those dollars are in are in European banks. So the Middle Eastern dollar reserves are sitting in part in Europe, right? So it's not necessarily about a specific US bank or the geographic territory of the United States. It's this remarkably liquid financial system that's been created since, you know, basically the financialization, the Volcker moves and so on since the 1980s. So it's a bigger issue. And our best guess is, all else equal, that it's going to be very hard to move away from that system, even as this crisis raises the question anew. The last time it was raised as a question was in 2008 during the financial crisis. And needless to say, from 2008 to 2021, not much has been done. China and Russia have a special agreement, but it barely impacts the kind of volume of trade that is supported by the current dollar-based finances.
Thanks, Bob. And there's another question that we just got about the Gulf regarding the discussion of the militarization of US foreign policy, particularly towards the Gulf, in order to not necessarily protect the flow of oil, but to maintain hegemonic control over production. How do arms sales factor into this equation, given the historic ineffectiveness of the Gulf militaries to carry out US national security establishment interests? More broadly, we're seeing these stories emerge in the news of Saudi Arabia and UAE not taking Biden's call, or some sort of sort of refusing to sort of meet US demands unless their own policies are met. Is this symptomatic of a broader shift? How do we make sense of this? I don't know if anyone has any thoughts about that.
I'll take the first part, and maybe Bob or Emily could take the second part of that. I'd be interested in what they have to say. On the arms sales, people think that the main piece of that is hardware. When you sell a jet plane, or say you'll hear a $10 billion jet sale to Saudi Arabia, maybe $2 billion of that is for metal hardware. The rest of it, the $8 billion, is for spares, training, maintenance, the air controllers, the things that make the piece of metal useful. And that $8 billion is largely performed by American contractors. I used to call them white collar mercenaries. And that's a form of control that the US exercises over these countries. They're highly dependent on American contractors. An interesting story about that, I think, is that during the reign of the Shah, when Iran was the biggest arms buyer of the US for a 10-year period and brought in all these new jets that the Iranians were not able to operate or maintain. And so something like 10,000 US contractors were brought in. And, when they wanted Western type of facilities and bars and prostitutes and the like, I don't know if all that was true, but that's one of the principal claims made by the clerics to arouse opposition to the Shah was that he was poisoning Iranian culture with Western values by bringing in these contractors. And Saudi Arabia has had problems with this too. But this is a form of control that arms sales brings with it. Maybe Bob could talk about the second part of this question, or Emily.
No, I'll just say one thing, and Tim, we need to have we can have a longer conversation about this. My first answer would be, what control over production? I see no control over production, so we would have to kind of explicate that. But I can expand that and sort of say, since the question is about what about hegemony, I would turn that around and sort of say, what hegemony? Okay, that the United States ostensibly exercises through this kind of presence in the Gulf. I haven't seen evidence of it. In fact, it's such a kind of it's seen as such a kind of what's the Foucauldian term for it? Like a granular power, capillary power, that you don't actually need evidence of its existence or it's actually being used. We just all believe it, right? But I can find you. It's never been exercised. So we'll leave it at that. This is an interesting power that we believe the US has that we've never actually seen it exercised. I would argue that maybe that doesn't exist. Michael is right that the Chinese are worried about cutoffs of oil, but that's not going to happen at Saudi Arabia, because you don't cut oil off. You don't cut Saudi Arabia's oils off to the world, you block the Chinese. So and Emily's smarter about this than I am, but the folks I've talked to sort of say, who think about naval strategy, is the way oil is going to be cut off, if it is during the course of a war, is going to happen in the South China Sea itself. It's going to happen through US naval presence there, not in the Fifth Fleet in the Persian Gulf. But, mostly this is all above my pay grade, so thanks.
Remember, it was Japan's fear that the US was going to do that to their oil supplies that led them to attack Pearl Harbor.
And the US was able to do that quite successfully in World War II, eventually, once we got close enough. And this is also one of the reasons that I'm skeptical about any arguments that claim that countries are trying to enhance their energy security by getting control over supplies in other countries, because you still have to get them home. That being said, it's hard to effectively implement. I don't think that the United States would be trying to blockade Chinese oil supplies outside of a war. It's way too aggressive. It's way too escalatory. But trying to figure out exactly which tankers you need to stop, especially in a region where a lot of that oil is also going to Japan and the Republic of Korea, it's a tall order. So if you don't know where the tankers are going, it's a huge hassle to try to stop each one, figure out where it's going. Also, oil can be sold after it passes through the Strait of Malacca and legitimately go to China after that. US could try to blockade nearer to China where you know where it's going, but that gets pretty dangerous. So I think China has actually taken a lot of steps to try to insulate itself against this energy insecurity. It's never going to be able to get all the way there as long as it relies on foreign energy supplies, but it's certainly tried. And it's been a pretty all of the above strategy. I think that the financial system is the one where it remains the most vulnerable. And that's going to be tough. And I think that this idea that Michael brought up earlier about, are we going to see really an intertwining of China and Russia even more than they are now when it comes to energy? And we've already seen that relationship building through China's investments in the Arctic, the completion of pipelines from Russia into northeastern China. And already China, I would say, was the stronger partner in these agreements. And the more we see Russia hurt by this war, the more we see it desperate for a buyer, the more leverage the Chinese are going to have over the Russians. I don't think they can exploit that in the current circumstances because of the likelihood of international censure for buying a lot more Russian oil right now. But depending on where this war goes, and I do not know where it's going, I think looking to see where those Chinese-Russian energy ties develop will be absolutely crucial, like Michael said, to where the global energy order is going. Oh, last thing, on the myths, I haven't seen a lot of myths, not the myths that I study about oil need and greed and competition. Still got some of that over the Arctic, and I am anticipating a real revival, not that they ever really went away, but a real revival of narratives about states fighting over oil and gas in the Arctic. It's not going to happen. Yeah, I have a paper working on why, but I expect to see that one pop back up. But overall, not so much. I haven't seen things saying, for example, that Russia's trying to invade Ukraine to seize its oil. So who knows? Maybe we'll see that applied retroactively, but not at the moment.
Thank you so much, Emily. And I had promised all our panelists that this would go for an hour, but we exceeded. I don't know if there are any, last words, Michael and Bob, and also Emily, or maybe other than your work, is there any good sources of information for people who want to follow what's happening in Ukraine, understanding, what's going on? Are there good blogs, things that people should be listening to or reading? If you have any suggestions about that before we leave, or any last words.
Yep. I did have a last word, but I also want Bob and Emily also to have last words too. So I did want to say one thing earlier that distinguishes this moment from the post 1973 era and even more recently. That'll make a difference is I think it was Emily or one of you was saying, the efforts that'll be made by Biden to look everywhere, or was that Bob? Doesn't matter. One thing that distinguishes this moment, why prices are high now, and that is that producing more oil today is different from what it was before, because getting oil out of the ground is harder. Yes. That's because we've used up all of the easily exploited oil. And from now, and oil companies say that, to develop a new field anywhere costs $5 or $10 billion investment, and it's a 5-year activity. Tar sands. There was a lot of talk about tar sands. Those are $10 billion investments. The Arctic is the same. Deep offshore is the same. All of that's the case. When COVID hit, they stopped making those investments. because they were worried that demand was drying up and that who knows how long this was going to last. And maybe, as Emily said, the peak demand was coming, and there wasn't a demand. So for the past few years, there's been the big oil companies haven't made those $10 billion investments in new fields. So now that demand has surged, they even if they wanted to increase supply, they can't, because they don't have the fields capable of doing that. So now they'll do that, but it'll be years before they'll be able to really ramp up production. And that's very different from the past. And that will be true in the future, because any new production is a very costly, extremely complicated, technologically, environmentally hazardous, and no quick fix. And that's why prices will be high. And before Russia, before Ukraine, before the war.
I don't have a last word. I like the reading list question. Okay. So for me, there's two things. I've learned a ton about dollarization, et cetera, over the past weeks and months, mostly by reading Adam Tooze. Now, Adam Tooze has a podcast. He's everywhere. And he has a chart book, which he produces 2 and 3 and 4 times a week. And he's been great. He's the guy that broke the story of the sanctions omitting oil. And Bannon, right? Stephen Bannon has jumped on that one and jumped on Tooze's interview on MSNBC about a week and a half ago to say that the U.S. is actually at war because this is actually an act of war against the financial system of Russia. So I'm sure Tooze wasn't trying to kind of weaponize Bannon, but nonetheless he's been really, really, really significant these past weeks. And he argues that we should be reading a book that I understand we have to read it. And I want to disagree with it, but I haven't been able to read it yet. But that's a new book by Helen Thompson called Disorder: Hard Times in the 21st Century. She's the latest materialist who tries to think about energy and the financial system as interlinked problems from the 70s on. So I have the book. I haven't read it. The materialists are too materialist to me, but Adam Tooze endorses it. So I'll stop there. And thank you for this, Omar.
I'll just mention a few other sources endorsing Bob said Marketplace and also Planet Money. If you're looking for real English, more real straightforward language explainers of how the global financial system works, they're great. Also, John Kemp, he writes for Reuters. He has an email list about the best in energy, and it's a great collection of stories every day. That's a terrific resource. Twitter, while I hesitate to recommend it, has been really great on the energy sanctions issue during the war in Ukraine. So those are all great resources. And just one other word is, in terms of silver linings, obviously in response to the perceived shortages, the temporary shortages, possibly not physical shortages, but current shortages of oil and gas, and the desire to get away from Russian oil and gas resources, we are seeing these discussions about trying to boost decarbonization and trying to boost use of renewables, alternatives. I'll be curious to see if nuclear makes its way back into the mix. But it does seem the amount of consensus around trying to make this pivot. I saw a poll, 79% of Americans say that they're in favor of not buying Russian oil. We'll see how long that enthusiasm lasts with $5 gas, but there's a momentum, and I'm really hoping that countries can jump in onto that in order to really push this conversation forward about decarbonization. I mean, we might just push the conversation forward about eliminating environmental regulations when it comes to oil and gas exploitation in the US. I hope we don't go as much in that direction, but it is an opportunity, and I'm waiting to see where that goes.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Emily, for ending us on that note. And I really appreciate you all coming today. This was really a rich discussion. I've learned a lot, and I'm still processing some of the things that we discussed today. And hopefully we can continue this discussion moving forward. So thank you all, Bob, Emily, and Michael. And thank you everyone for attending. Bye.